Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. Sugi, your parents immigrated to the US. You're South Asian. You have any unusual stories about going through immigration at the airport?
Oh, do I? But this episode is only like half an hour and change long. So I will just say that I am often flagged for the quote unquote routine check. And I'm sure that there are people who have it worse than me. That is not much fun. And those encounters can really make you feel like an outsider in
What do you do during
your
the
own
routine
space.
check?
I mean, what do I do? I have like I I'm routinely checked. I mean, I
Meaning, like,
don't
do they go through your bags or something? Or,
let's see, yeah, they check your bags, they can check your hair, they frisk you, right?
oh,
Female officer needed. I've had my hair checked once. I know that that happens more to other people. And yeah, often like items removed from my bag, I'm asked to explain things. Yeah, it's
we know
just
how good you are at explaining things. That should be fine.
I love it. I love it. I am a very patient person. Oh my God. Okay. Anyway, so for like many people, like I'm actually like, right, I was born in the US. But yeah, my parents are immigrants. And for many immigrants, this kind of like tension of feeling like an outsider in your own space is, I mean, it's everywhere. It's at schools, workplaces, hospitals, not just airports. So even just kind of like walking down the street, you can feel right, like that feeling of being surveilled, can be really pervasive.
And I think that it seems like that feeling or that tension, particularly for people from immigrant communities, is even worse right now. Trump campaigned on xenophobia and now says he's going to implement his plans for mass deportation on his first day in office. A lot of people don't know what that means, including me. Um, Sounds crazy. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, I think the national anxiety attack, and I really do not mean that phrase glibly, but right, like his first term was a nightmare for immigrants, their families, BIPOC Americans, those with connections to Muslim countries. Our listeners, of course, I'm sure remember the quote Muslim ban. It's also true that Trump's plans for deportation the first time around didn't match what he was actually able to execute. And this is like actually one of the scary things about him, that like it's very hard to match what he says with any any reliable anticipation. You kind of just don't know what to anticipate at all. But like here's some stats. Barack Obama still holds the record for deportations in a year, 432,000 people in 2013. So Trump has said he's going to deport something like 20 million people. Like, how would you even get that done? Does he have a way to make that happen? What terrible effects is that going to have? Yeah, I just kind of feel broadly worried about it because I can't totally figure it out.
Fortunately, to think this through, today we're joined by a debut fiction writer who's written an extraordinary book that has immigration as one of its central themes. Ruben Reyes Jr. is the son of two Salvadoran immigrants and the author of There is a Rio Grande in Heaven, or Rio Grande, I suppose would be the right way to say that, which came out earlier this year and was longlisted for the Aspen Words Literary Prize and the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and Harvard, he has published his work in the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, Lightspeed magazine, and other publications. Originally from Southern California, he now lives in Queens. Ruben, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you here. As you know, I loved your book, and we're going to talk about that book in a bit. But first, we want to break down these Project 2025 plans for immigrants. Terrifying. As we were talking about at the top of the show, this didn't exactly start off in the best place. Obama deported a record number of people. Still holds the record for most president deporting the most number of people in a year. During the Biden administration, Republican governors and like especially Greg Abbott in Texas have been extremely vocal about an increased number of arrivals at the border. And some Republicans have been transporting new immigrants to cities and states run by Democrats without warning to make a point, they claim, but really putting those people in danger, not really giving the places where they're arriving an opportunity to prepare to support them, et cetera. What's your take on kind of the current state of immigration in the US before Trump even makes a move?
Yeah, that's all really important points. Um, my biggest kind of worry and fear is that the fear mongers are kind of winning right now. I think the Obama years are really kind of tricky to think about in regards to immigration reform because it was a time of such contrast, right? Activists called Obama deporter in chief at the same time that he passed executive orders like DACA, right? They gave a lot of young people uh, a relief from the deportation machine, the ability to work and change lots of lives. Um, I think right now I'm really interested in the way that the Democratic Party has actually shifted a little bit to the right on these issues in an attempt to stay competitive with Republicans who have gone off the deep end with this stuff. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, it's definitely worrying overall. I think that the big difference between, the two major parties in the US is the way we talk about immigration and the rhetoric that's used, which I think is really important, uh, given that that's the basis of all our policies. But at the same time, Biden kept Title 42 for basically 3 years of his administration after promising to get rid of it, and that was a Trump invention, right? So it's really hard to talk about the differences between the parties in particular when they kind of share this desire to I don't know to present ourselves as a country with strong and unchanging borders. Um,
I
It
mean, it
seems
yeah,
seems to
like
me like the Democrats deport a lot of people, but then talk nice about it, and the Republicans just are mean and then get votes for being meaner than the Democrats. Am I completely wrong about that sort of simplification of the issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's what it definitely feels like this is like the one of the major issues I have with the Democratic Party is that I'm so much far left on this issue in particular. Um, I think it's obviously more complicated than that. And I think the really worrying thing is that Republicans like Greg Abbott and Donald Trump are threatening to make things worse, to go even further, right? To deport more people, but also to get rid of some basic rights, like the right to apply for asylum when you're in the US. They talk about birthright citizenship. That's an enshrined right, right? But they would love to get rid of it for the children of immigrants like me, it feels like. Um, yeah, so it's complicated and scary.
so. Ruben, just for our listeners who might not know, can you explain what Title 42 is?
Yeah. Title 42 was basically a policy that the Trump administration put in place during COVID under the claims of like public health issues that basically required people, it allowed the government to get immigrants from all over at the southern border and force them to remain in Mexico, basically. Uh, when the general policy is that you're allowed to enter when you're seeking asylum and be processed and stay in the U.S. Um, and of course, the issue was it increased the numbers of on paper expulsions and also put immigrants into really dangerous situations in these border towns that were kind of, overrun and just don't have the infrastructure to deal with as many people as they were dealing with. Um, yeah, so and that was a policy that I don't know. It's really fascinating to me that in 2018, right, it was all about how cruel Trump was being to immigrants. By the time we hit 2020, it's like a small part of the election. Biden makes some promises about immigration that he doesn't follow through on. Yeah.
And I guess now we're about to see what promises Trump is going to follow through on.
Well,
Yeah.
one of them is that he's going to deport as many as 20 million people. Other people, including private security companies, are talking about detention facilities, which I don't know. All of this seems, aside from the moral issues here, which are important, but also would be very expensive, would drive up inflation, grocery prices, significant portion of our agricultural labor force is our immigrants, right? And Trump has also said he would involve the military in these plans and will invoke the Enemies Act of 1798, which is something he kept saying on the stump, which gives authorities broad powers to deport people identified as foreign enemies. what does the, I mean, does he know what this is going to look like? Can you imagine what this would actually in practice look like?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he knows. I doubt he knows. I bet he has a concept of a plan or whatever he's been saying. Um, I think I'm of two minds on it, right? I think that he's real threat, especially if he's able to kind of pull back some of the legal rights and processes that immigrants and refugees have benefited from, which I think, you know, a Department of Homeland Security that's on his side could do that. On the other hand, I think it's really logistically difficult to do what he's promising because both the lives and the systems under which immigrants uh, live are really complicated, right? There's a lot of people that are in the system somehow, and there's a lot of people that aren't. It's not clear how he's going to prioritize, deportations if he even decides to, pursue them. Um, and then there's the question of who's going to do it, how's it going to be done. Um, I think the optimistic side of me is that he's a lot of talk, and when it comes down to logistics, it could fall apart. All that said, I do think that they, could build on some of the things that he did during his first term, which were really harmful and difficult to watch and read about.
Well, one of the things that happened the previous time was like a lot of resistance from local law enforcement where, or, sanctuary states where like there was more or less, right, people saying like local law enforcement is not going to support the actions of ICE, et cetera, in terms of raids, detention, et cetera, that like local law enforcement is going to resist this. I've seen like some calls right, for like local, like on the state level, on the local level to kind of resist this. Of course, it's going to be a lot easier to do in states that are blue than in states that are red. There are more states that are red this time around.
Well,
I
wait,
don't
but
really.
Suki, did you hear about he's proposing a like commission, this just came out today or in the last couple of days, to sort of vet generals, and get rid of generals who he thinks are insufficiently loyal. And I think, and people are speculating that, yes, this is in anticipation of local law enforcement resisting deportation things. So you just use the army.
I did not hear about this because we are apparently drinking from a news sewage hose.
Okay.
And like
Well,
I
just letting you know, in
can't keep
case
up
you
with the
were curious.
pace.
Sorry,
No, it's
your theory
just
doesn't work.
like a new feature of our podcast is the moment where Whitney's like, "Hey Sugi, do you know about this fucking awful thing?" And I'm like, then everyone gets to like see what it looks like when I find out.
Okay.
So Trump compares himself to Eisenhower, who infamously ran a deportation plan called Operation Wetback, that being, of course, a racist slur for Mexicans. And that resulted in the deportation of hundreds of thousands of people, including some US citizens, according to The Guardian. And like, there's so many households with mixed status in the US today. I was reading a stat that said something like, 70% of households with like where there's an undocumented person, like there's of course also someone with legal status. How are people with different immigration statuses going to be affected by these plans?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for listeners, right, when we talk about mixed status families, we're generally referring to any kind of, usually it's referring to like a nuclear family, but not necessarily a family where people have different citizenship status. So this could be a parent who's undocumented and, has a citizen child, or I know of a lot of families where, it might be four siblings and some of them are citizens, some of them have DACA, some might not have any status at all. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think that actually is what gets missed a lot in all this rhetoric, especially from the Trump administration, right? His so-called border czar, right? A couple of weeks ago was talking about, someone asked him, like, so how do you do mass deportations without separating families? And his answer was, oh, we just deport them all together. We don't separate the families. We deport everyone. You can't do that to a mixed status family, right? Like that's not legal. Let's set aside the moral issues there. Um, and so I don't know. I think that's kind of the big flaw in one of the many flaws in trying to take this kind of scorched earth approach to deportation. Every single person in this country, including immigrants, including refugees, are part of a social network, and you can't just immediately break those bonds. You can't pull them out of their communities that easily. Um, and I think that's, that's maybe the glimmer of hope in all this is that, all these people who we often boil down to numbers or statistics or talking points are part of communities that need them and will vouch for them. Um, but yeah, but back maybe to your question a little bit, the other thing I'll say is that the thing that I'm maybe most worried about are these kind of most liminal of protections, right? So things that were put in by either have to be renewed by Congress or were put in by executive order, things like DACA or TPS, temporary protected status, right? It's just a fraction of the people who are in the United States, but these are things that could change at a whim within the administration, and they were fought over and over during the last Trump admin. So I guess those are the folks that I'm maybe most worried about and curious to see what actions people will take to try protecting them. Because I think there will be a kind of subcurrent of resistance, just like there was last Trump admin.
Well, those include the people famously that Trump referred to famously in Ohio who were Haitian, who were under temporary protected status, and were there because the city had requested them to come to do work, and then Trump decided to demonize them, and he said repeatedly on the stump, like, I will deport all of those people. It's illegal. The idea of temporary protected status is itself illegal. I don't know if he can do that, but that seems alarming. I mean, also, maybe the people of Springfield who run the businesses that these people work at wouldn't like that. I don't know. Do they have a choice? I mean, those are the complications that I'm also trying to imagine my way through.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, it's that's the really difficult thing about immigration, both on a policy level, on a moral level, when I deal with it in literature, right? Is there's such a gap between the kind of prejudice and rhetoric that politicians think will win elections, and we've seen actually do help win elections. There's a big gap
Yeah.
between that rhetoric and the lived reality of people on the ground. And I think I'm interested in that messy area actually, both politically and artistically, because I think there's so much room to write into that gray space, to think through that gray space. Um, yeah.
Well, we want to talk about your wonderful book, which I do feel like like the way that your book engages with politics in history is really so profound and wonderful. It's unusually and beautifully structured with immigration, as we said earlier, as one of its major themes. And your parents are Salvadoran immigrants. Can you talk a little bit about how you started to write the book and how it connects to the histories of immigration that you know?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it really starts with who I was as a reader, right? I was a big sci-fi kid. I was a big fantasy kid. I didn't grow up in a household that had that many books. My parents aren't huge readers, and so I just read things I could get my hands on at the public library or in used bookstores, a lot of Mike Crichton. Um, and then eventually, when I went to college, I finally kind of discovered Latinx literature. It's amazing that it took that long, but it wasn't until college that I started reading immigrant authors who were capturing something about my upbringing as a son of two immigrants in Southern California, in a very multicultural suburb of Southern California. Um, and so, when I started writing my own stuff, I was kind of mixing these two selves and getting them to crash together into what became this book. And somewhere along the process, when I decided I was going to be writing about El Salvador and my experiences, growing up, going to El Salvador, coming back, having parents who grew up there and missed family there often, um, I knew that I would have to talk about immigration. And that kind of spiraled, right? Because there's like the emotional experiences of immigration, but then there's all the other historical and political stuff that I'm really interested in, right? Histories of imperialism. In the case of El Salvador, the 12-year civil war that the US funded. And so all those things also made their way into the book, all with, the kind of speculative tilt that really, you know, got me into reading and keeps me coming back.
So we wanted to ask you to read from one of the really strong stories in the book that we both enjoyed called The Myth of the Self-Made Man. Uh, could you do that for us?
Yeah, of course. So this story, to just give a tiny bit of setup, is about a researcher about 150 years in the future who is uh, trying to understand the history of the self-made men who are basically cyborgs designed and sold to do domestic work. And as the story goes on, we learn that things are a little more sinister maybe than they seem. Um, so I'll read from a section that is actually a monologue from one of these self-made men. Americans say that self-made men enjoy the work, that we comply because we have no sense of ourselves before we were manufactured. They point to how willingly we help and how we even seem to love the families we work for. That's mechanics, not anatomy. I was condemned to follow their bidding, and though the settings on my emotional meter released a flow of endorphins to my body, anger simmered inside my body too. I wouldn't understand the scope of my imprisonment until I met the wonderful volunteers at Southside Presbyterian, but even then, as I lived it, my body yearned for freedom. After years of suffering, I escaped by sheer chance. There's a glitch in the technology used to hardwire the brains of self-made man. It appears after several years. If our agency meter is turned to the highest setting, it gives us more autonomy than the manufacturers intended. The eldest child in the family, a 10-year-old named Sarah, was toying with my settings. I'm unsure what she was trying to do, but she left my agency meter at the highest possible setting. Then, when no one was home, I escaped through a gate in the backyard and never looked back. After I ran away and the organization who brought me here tonight offered me sanctuary, I learned what had happened to me and those other boys. We were kidnapped by men working for a company called Diaz Manufacturing. They gather hundreds of children at the border every year and load them, unconscious, into trucks that bring them to warehouses thousands of miles away. The company keeps saying that the boys they source are lab grown or otherwise ethically acquired, but I'm here to prove that they've been lying. I never asked to be this way. I never asked to be a self-made man. Violence, in both minuscule and enormous forms, takes its toll. As I stand in front of you in this church, know that I've only been able to reconstruct the story I'm telling tonight with a lot of help, with a lot of therapy, and with hours of deep digging. And I know that my narrative, the one I've tried to lay out as faithfully and succinctly as possible, is not unique. All those other boys in captivity, all sold. The hundreds of thousands that came before and after me, you can find them in almost every suburb in this country. I'm asking that you, as lovers of freedom and justice, and as Americans, help us right this wrong. Children don't deserve to be kidnapped and kept away from their families any longer. This is happening under our noses, but it persists because we don't care. We listen to the company's spokespeople when they tell us nothing is amiss, that their product is only meant to help us. And because it is convenient, we believe the talking heads and we ignore the children at the border. The pamphlets you received when you walked in tonight have more detailed steps on how to help. Boycotting DS manufacturing, donating to our organization, raising awareness about this kidnapping crisis. Perhaps the most important thing you can do, though, is to help people like me, refugees, men stripped of their freedom, retrieve some of our humanity. This country, this company, has stripped me of so much, not least of all my name. My owners called me Pedro. My name is Jose Manuel Hernandez. This is my story. Listen to it, I beg you. Listen to my people when we tell you who we are and why we're here. Listen to them so I can leave this chapel and finally live out in the open, free of fear or persecution. Like the Bible says in John 8:32, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. I've told you the truth, and now I ask that you help me in our struggle towards liberation. Stand with me until we are all free. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Um, it's so wild to listen to that passage and think about what actually happened to children at the border under the last Trump administration. What is happening to some children at the border now? Right. I of course think of family separation. The fact that I was looking this up this morning. I think it's something like 1,400 children where people don't know like what happened to them after they were separated from their families during the last administration. And there's a section in the story like that talks about how authentic the self-made man is. They're made and assembled in the US and distributed only in America, right? It's kind of like this very made in America discourse. And as that the section that you just read tells us, like there are young children who are kidnapped from the US Mexican border. And you think of Trump's remark about immigrants coming to the US poisoning the blood of our country. That's a quote. And of course, like we're so reliant on the labor of immigrants. We make it invisible. We are complicit in like seeing things the way that it would be convenient for us to see them. So can you talk a little bit about how you thought through the premise of that story as you were writing it in relation to these politics? Like when did you start writing that story? How did you revise it? And also so I'm gonna sneak one more question in there, but like it's a frame story. Whitney's always like, try not to
Yeah.
make every question a kitchen sink, but here it goes. Right, like it's a researcher.
I'm
He's
taking
like
notes here. Maybe I'll figure this out.
it's a researcher who is like trying to understand who the
Yeah.
self-made man is. So like, how did you decide to do it that way as opposed to just like trying to write from the point of view of a self-made man in like a less framed fashion? Kind of interested in that
Yeah.
craft decision.
Yeah, totally. I love those questions. Um, it's actually really weird to read it out loud. It's been a while since I've read it out loud, and it's kind of emotional how, I knew what I was doing. I wanted to write about the moment that I was writing in, which was, 2018, during the Trump administration, during the worst of family separation. Um, but hearing what I wrote then, in the context of the story, but seeing that it still applies and that it could apply in worse ways, um, is a lot. But I guess to answer the question, I was really specifically thinking about those couple of weeks in 2018 when there was all this focus on these caravans. Um, I thought that it was like the most, it's amazing how much more dehumanizing things can get. But all the talk of the caravans was so dehumanizing in a very like literal way, right? It was like not these people leaving their homes, but this like horde or like this organ, like I don't know, like this big just mass uh of danger or something headed to the US. And so, I thought, okay, so if we're gonna talk about immigrants from Central America as half human at best, right? Only partially human. Let me go there. Let me write a story about cyborgs. And that's kind of where the idea first came from. And then, once I kind of dug into the uh, concept, I knew I wanted to write about labor. Immigrants are so often, you know, boiled down to what they can offer economically, right? Even by well-meaning people, right? There's always undocumented people pay taxes, which is true, right? Or, if we deport all undocumented people, who's going to pick our produce, which is true, but also, kind of weirdly dehumanizing in another way. And so I knew that it was going to be a story about labor, which is why the self-made men were domestic workers. Um, and then it just kind of went from there. I love your question about the frame story. The initial draft was not a frame story. It was more like found documents, which is still part of the story structure, but without a frame. But at that point, I had a number of these like self-made men, right? So the literal self-made men who are cyborgs, but also these kind of Latinx children of immigrants who pursue social mobility, right? There's a billionaire who makes them. He's a self-made man. And then eventually I wanted a self-made man that would kind of take the position that I'm in, right? As a child of immigrants who's had the privileges of an education. And so then I decided to write a child of immigrants researcher who was looking into this history. And it allowed me to introduce another self-made man and think about, the questions of social mobility and how immigration does or does not make that possible, which is another big theme in this book.
I
Okay,
thought it
yeah.
was like, yeah. So, I mean, it just was right. It is Diaz manufacturing. Like, I thought that was one of the things the story did that was really, I mean, as we look at the news, like so much of what we see is, I mean, like people who we whose lives theoretically could be aligned with like left politics, like Stephen Miller, child of immigrants from Belarus, like Usha Vance, et cetera, et cetera. And like, how do
Yeah.
these people come to be some of the people who profit from causing harm to others? I felt a little bit like I was reading a story where like I was like, ProPublica is going to investigate this later, and there's going to be an expose. That's really just it's a great story.
But I also heard numerous like election gurus on the left and Latino like commentators and people who study polls saying like, hey, talking about immigration is not a good way to win Latino voters in America. Like that a lot of people agree with what Trump's doing, or at least his rhetoric. They may not understand fully what this policy is going to be. And I wanted to mention in our earlier discussion, I wanted to bring this up, like Tim Homan, who's going to be what Department of
Border czar, I
uh,
think, is the
the border czar, right, has said when asked,
whatever
like,
it
what do
is.
you do with mixed families, right? He said, well, the whole family could be deported, which would mean including the citizens in it.
Yeah.
So, I would like you to address that particular aspect of the election.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, right? Like the big shock, or one of the big shocks maybe to a lot of pollsters and I think a lot of liberals, was how many Latino men in particular supported Trump this time around, right? It's a possibility that I think s- to establishment Democrats seemed impossible to understand. To me, like I was not all that surprised, right? Um, One of the things that I was thinking a lot about when I was writing this book was the fact that the Latinx community is not a monolith, not only because we come from so many different countries, but because of all the other things that divide us: class, citizenship, gender, all these things. Um, and, in the literature that I grew up reading, especially uh, some of the foundational stuff I read, it was always about, a Latinx character or protagonist, up against white America, up against the white gaze, which is a very real part of the experience of being Latinx in the US. It's something I've dealt with in my life. But I was really interested in how the Latinx community fails itself, right? Um, and and so that's basically what I was tackling in many of these stories, right? Um, because there is this phenomenon of very in particular with the issue of immigration, of people who immigrated here, right, who you might assume are big supporters of immigration reform or of more refugees, who actually kind of quickly maybe become their most American selves and quickly say, no, no, don't let anyone else, right? They separate themselves um, from more recent arrivals. Um, I see that it's wild to see that even from Salvadorans, right? And sometimes people who came much more recently than you would imagine. But it's definitely just part of part of what happens when you have such a large and divided community. Um, the flaw, of course, being is assuming that they're not that way, which is why I wanted that my fiction at least to honor that truth.
It's not like people from other countries are immune from admiring or falling prey to strong men. I mean, if you read Juan Rulfo's Pedro Paramo, I mean, that's what that book is entirely about,
Right.
And yeah.
Or you
So
have, right, or you have like a whole subset of Latinx uh basically immigrants and communities who fled like leftist authoritarian governments in Latin America,
right.
right? Like, of course they're gonna be anti-democrat and pro-Trump. And I think like in American politics, we think, oh, like, yeah, those are the Cubans who like fled Fidel Castro. But it's like not just them now, right? It's much more, yeah, it's a much wider swath. And like all of these things are so like I feel like they're so granular and we don't get to them. We like don't have the space in media or literature or most realms to really have these discussions. So with my book, I was like, okay, we're gonna show this. Like we're gonna show these divisions because they're important and they're real. Yeah.
So, in one of your other stories, Try Again, the main character tries to reimagine his late father using technology, which I think is called Sync Life.
Hmm.
And at first it works. But later the device kind of repeats the habits of his human father. there are other stories in here in which kind of different paths lead to similar conclusions, or there's an attempt to change something and like it doesn't quite work. There's a story that kind of gestures to a choose your own adventure structure that mimics certain parts of a migrant's journey. Given the oppressive systems that we're dealing with, these histories that are so actively being erased, how did you think about writing about agency and possibility for these characters and their families in those stories, and also the others in the collection? Like, does history just repeat itself?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that was one, you know, when you're first writing, at least when I'm first writing, I'm writing kind of intuitively, not thinking through too much. Um, but at some point when I was pretty close to thinking about this as a book, I realized that I was, thinking a lot about agency. Um, and my kind of big issue was this kind of paradox that I thought emerged for a lot of immigrant characters in particular, which is that, I think most traditional maybe advice for fiction writers is like make sure your character has agency, right? Like the most compelling stories are those where someone is put in a difficult position and has to make a choice, where their actions have consequences. Which is true, I think, actually. But it's also very individualistic. And I think it's why, the broader tradition of at least American literature is about the individual, is about the kind of hero's journey. That wasn't quite working when I was trying to write about people whose agency was stripped away in some way by these systems, right? Especially migrant children who I was really interested in writing about. And so I think a lot of these stories are an attempt to kind of honor that paradox, right? The fact that these are individual characters with individual lives who are able to make choices, but who also live under these systems that, strip away their autonomy, right? Your choose your own adventure story was like, I think the most direct way of approaching that, because I was able to put the reader kind of in the position of the migrant child by the structure of the form. Um, but also I was able to play around with the question of choice, right? There are points in that story where you think you as a reader, you as the character have a choice to make, and it turns out no, actually. Like the story takes you where I want you to go. Um, but yeah, it's definitely something I think a lot about, and I think it's really tricky to balance. Um, Also, you had the question about time. I mean, I think time is kind of a circle. I think that's what the book posits in some way. And that's because I, as an undergrad trained as a historian, partially, and I was seeing a lot of things repeating themselves. And I also wanted to kind of honor the way that Salvadoran history, things are linked, right? The current immigration quote unquote crisis is not separate from the Civil War that the US funded. Um, Trump made a big kind of boogeyman out of MS-13 in his first term, right? He was talking about MS-13 as justification for his immigration policies. MS-13 formed in Los Angeles because of the Civil War and got its stronghold in El Salvador in part because of the kind of law and order policies that US politicians wanted politicians in El Salvador to take on. Um, and so these histories are connected, and I needed my fiction to show that too. So that's kind of a side tangent, but it's part of it. The other thing I'll say about agency in fiction and writing about immigrants is that I did want to make sure there was always a little, some of these stories are quite sad and deal with a lot of difficult issues, but I always wanted to leave kind of a little bit of hope or some kind of escape valve, at least for the characters. And so, in a story like Try Again, right, this relationship with the father is fraught, but there's a boyfriend who really offers some relief. And I think that's another kind of thing I had in mind because that's just what, immigrants' lives are like, right? It's the good and the bad and all in between. Yeah.
Ruben, thanks so much for joining us to talk about all this. And listeners, please don't miss his book, There is a Rio Grande in Heaven, available at an independent bookstore near you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.